The first thing that struck me was the silence. A dead, suffocating quiet that settled over the waters like a shroud. I'd grown up along the coast of Mississippi, the Gulf of Mexico, practically a second home to me. But that day, as we drifted deeper into the endless oil-slicked expanse, the water felt different. Not alive, not dead, something in between. I've faced storms that lit the horizon on fire and waterspouts that threatened to swallow boats whole. Those were thrilling, sure, but predictable in their chaos. What I experienced during the Deepwater Horizon spill in 2010 was something else entirely. Something that clawed at your mind and stayed with you no matter how many showers you took to scrub it off. When the oil rig exploded, spewing crude like black blood into the Gulf, BP scrambled to piece together a cleanup operation. They invited boat owners to join the effort, promising good pay and the chance to help restore our wounded waters. I didn't hesitate. The Gulf wasn't just where I lived, it was part of me. I got my hazmat certification and joined a fleet of fishing and charter boats repurposed for cleanup. My first assignment was on a 127-foot vessel that ferried clients to the Chandeleur Islands for fishing trips. Those islands are a paradise, or at least they were. Now they looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic nightmare, stained and smothered by thick, viscous oil. For weeks my job was simple: search for crude slicks, log their locations, and report back. The waters we scouted turned darker each day, the oil clinging to everything it touched like a disease. Then came the day that changed everything. We were nearly 100 miles offshore when we hit the thickest oil yet, 6 inches deep in most spots, a foot in others. The stench hit you first, sharp and acrid, burning your throat before you even stepped out onto the deck. The water didn't look like water anymore. It was a black, sluggish mass, churning and writhing like it was alive. And then we found the life jacket. It floated there, half submerged in the sludge, the name on it scrawled and faded but still legible. It belonged to one of the workers from the rig, a man who never made it home. I don't know why, but I reached out and grabbed it. The fabric was slick with oil, cold to the touch, and I swear it felt like it pulsed in my hands. It was as if the Gulf itself was trying to speak, to scream its agony. From that moment, nothing felt the same. The cleanup shifted into high gear, and our small fleet was tasked with more than just reporting. We donned hazmat suits and worked in suffocating heat, wrangling the crude with skimmers and booms, sweating under layers of protective gear as the oil seeped into every crack and crevice it could find. The sight of dead fish and sea turtles became our new normal, and I began to feel like we were fighting a losing battle against something far beyond our control. One day, while working about 20 miles past the Barrier Islands, we saw something on the horizon that stopped us cold. The water ahead was boiling, or at least it looked like it. Reds, oranges, and yellows swirled together in a mesmerizing, almost hypnotic display. As we drew closer, we realized it wasn't the water, but a massive school of redfish and jack crevalle, their bodies shimmering and writhing in unison. It should have been beautiful. It should have been a sign of life. But all I could think about was the life jacket. The school stretched as far as we could see, hundreds of yards wide, a kaleidoscope of scales against the grim backdrop of the oil-stained Gulf. For a brief moment I felt hope. Maybe what we were doing wasn't in vain. Maybe the Gulf could heal. But then I noticed the fish weren't swimming. They were struggling. The oil was suffocating them, dragging them down like unseen hands, pulling them into the depths. The Gulf was still bleeding, still crying out, and we were powerless to stop it. To this day, I can't shake the memories. The sight of the slick, black water swallowing the horizon. The sound of the silence out there, so profound it felt like a curse. And that life jacket, bobbing lifelessly in the current. A grim reminder of the lives lost and the scars left behind. They say the Gulf is healing now, that the marine life is slowly returning, but I know better. Beneath the waves, buried in the sediment, The oil still lingers, waiting, and every now and then when the waters are calm and the air is still, I think I can hear it. A faint whisper carried on the wind, a warning, a plea, a curse. There's something about being underwater that makes you feel utterly vulnerable. A world where the rules of survival shift and danger lurks in silence. If I'd known how close I'd come to death, I would never have stepped onto that boat in Bali. I was a scuba instructor back then, leading a group of young vacationers on an underwater walking excursion. They were a lively bunch, couples and friends in their early 20s, buzzing with excitement. For most of them, this was a fun novelty. For me, it was supposed to be just another day at work. It wasn't. The mothership was a larger boat we used as a base for diving, but it had its quirks. Painted on its hull was a massive, ominous alien head, a tongue-in-cheek nod to its name. The group loved it, snapping pictures and laughing as we approached. Little did I know that painted face would haunt my memory in the weeks to come. Underwater walking itself was a newer activity at the time. Instead of traditional scuba gear, we used sci-fi-looking helmets connected to oxygen tubes that floated on the surface. It was supposed to be safer, easier. It wasn't. As the first to descend, I felt the weight of the helmet immediately pulling me downward. The sensation was unnerving. The pressure mounted quickly, making my ears throb until I yawned and swallowed to adjust. Even breathing felt strange. Every inhale created a vacuum, forcing me to pause as the helmet refilled with air. I chalked it up to part of the experience and motioned for the others to follow. Once everyone was underwater, the guide handed us bags of bread to attract fish. Within seconds, the water swarmed with vibrant, darting creatures, brushing against us like curious ghosts. The group was delighted, their laughter muffled by the helmets. But for me, the constant whir of the oxygen tube was an unsettling reminder of our reliance on the surface. And then it happened. The sound stopped. For a moment I froze, expecting the system to kick back in just as it had earlier. 2 seconds passed, then 3. The air returned and I exhaled in relief, telling myself it was just a minor hiccup. But it wasn't over. The interruption happened again, lasting a few seconds longer this time. I glanced at the guide, who didn't seem concerned. Still, the unease in my chest grew heavier. My instincts told me something was off, but I pushed the thought aside. The guide motioned for me to follow him over a railing, leading me along a narrow path flanked by sharp corals. The current was stronger here, tugging at my air tube and making every step a struggle. I looked back at the group to ensure they were following. They were, or so I thought. And then, the whir stopped again. This time, it didn't come back. 5 seconds. I tried to stay calm. 10 seconds. My chest tightened. 15 seconds. The training drilled into me screamed, "Don't panic!" But panic doesn't listen to logic. I signaled to the guide, pounding my chest in the universal sign for I can't breathe. He turned, his expression unreadable through his mask, then started moving away. My mind raced. Was he leading me to safety or abandoning me? The pressure in my lungs became unbearable. Water started seeping into the helmet, each droplet a harbinger of doom. I tilted my head back, desperately sucking at the diminishing pocket of air. My vision blurred, and the world around me felt distant, like I was sinking into an abyss. 30 seconds. My body screamed for oxygen, but my mind kept replaying the risks of removing the helmet, getting the bends, hitting my head on the boat, or simply drowning before I reached the surface. 40 seconds. I clung to the guide, my grip ironclad, as if holding him could anchor me to life. Then I saw it, the ladder leading up to the boat. Adrenaline surged through me. With every ounce of strength, I reached for the ladder, my fingers fumbling against the rungs as the helmet distorted my perception. When I finally grasped it, I pulled myself upward with everything I had. As my head broke the surface, air flooded back into the helmet. I gasped, sucking in lungfuls of sweet, life-giving oxygen. Relief crashed over me like a tidal wave, but it was short-lived. Looking back, I don't know what haunted me more: the suffocating moments underwater, or the realization that down there, you're utterly at the mercy of the equipment, the guides, and the depths themselves. I quit being a scuba instructor not long after that. To this day, the thought of descending into the ocean fills me with dread. I don't recommend underwater walking, not to anyone. The year was 1941, a time when the seas were restless, not just from storms, but from the silent predators lurking beneath. I was aboard the SS Britannia, a vessel that promised safe passage to India amidst the chaos of war. Little did I know, the ship carried more than its passengers. It bore secrets, and perhaps something far darker. The night before departure from Liverpool, I had a dream, vivid and unsettling. I saw a vast ocean stretching endlessly, its surface shimmering unnaturally under a blood-red moon. In the distance, a shadowy figure stood on the water, pointing directly at me. When I woke up, I laughed it off as pre-departure nerves. But now, looking back, I wish I had heeded the warning. We set sail on March 11th, 1941. At first, the journey seemed uneventful, save for the constant rolling of the ship that left me seasick for days. The ship's escorts, a few destroyers and an armed merchant cruiser, were supposed to ensure our safety, but something about their presence felt futile, like a fragile barrier against an inevitable fate. Then came March 25th. The morning was oppressively hot, the kind that clings to your skin and drains your energy. I was lying on my bunk, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. A low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the ship. It wasn't the engine. It was something alive. Moments later, a thunderous explosion shattered the eerie calm. I stumbled to the porthole and saw fountains of water erupting around the ship. The tannoy crackled to life, the voice of the captain trembling as he announced we were under attack by a German raiding vessel. Panic spread like wildfire. Soldiers barked orders, passengers screamed, and the ship groaned as if it were alive and in agony. I ran to the deck, only to be met with chaos. The enemy shells were relentless, and the air was thick with smoke and fear. Our small rear gun tried to fight back, but its efforts were silenced with a deafening blast. The crew manning it were gone, obliterated in an instant. The lifeless bodies of those who had once been my fellow passengers and crew now littered the deck, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Then came the order we dreaded: abandon ship. I joined the desperate crowd scrambling for lifeboats. There was no sense of order, just raw primal survival. By sheer luck, I managed to find a lifeboat that wasn't damaged. As we lowered it into the churning sea, the cries of those left behind echoed in my ears, their voices fading into the smoke and fire as the Britannia was pummeled into submission. But the true horror was yet to come. As we drifted away from the burning wreck, I saw it. The German raiding ship, its deck lined with men, their faces devoid of emotion as they finished the job. A final barrage of shells struck below the Britannia's waterline, and the ship let out a sound I'll never forget. A mournful, almost human wail before disappearing beneath the waves. We were adrift for days, baking under the relentless sun, tormented by the ceaseless presence of sharks. They circled us like specters, their dead black eyes watching, waiting. The faintest splash would draw them closer, their fins slicing through the water, a chilling reminder of how fragile our existence had become. One man in our lifeboat, a quiet fellow who had barely spoken since the attack, finally cracked. Without a word, he stood, put on his overcoat, and stepped overboard. The sea swallowed him whole, his body disappearing before we could even cry out. His heavy clothing dragged him into the abyss, but his final act stayed with us, a haunting symbol of despair. The nights were the worst. The ocean was eerily still, the silence broken only by the soft lapping of waves against the lifeboat. But there were moments, fleeting yet unforgettable, when we heard whispers. They came from nowhere, faint and unintelligible, as if the sea itself was speaking. Some of us dismissed it as the wind. Others were too afraid to say what we were all thinking, that the voices belonged to those who had perished, their souls trapped in the water, calling out to us. By the time we were rescued, we were barely alive. A Spanish vessel spotted our flare, and we were pulled aboard, weak and delirious. As I climbed the rope ladder, my hands blistered and bleeding, I couldn't help but glance back at the ocean. For a moment, I thought I saw it again, the shadowy figure from my dream, standing on the waves watching us. Even now, decades later, I can't escape the memories. The ocean's whispers still haunt me, and in the quiet moments of the night, I hear the wail of the Britannia as it sank. Some say the sea forgets, but I know better. It remembers. The darkness of the Atlantic was a living thing, its waves whispering promises of death. The storm was ferocious, battering Stephen Callahan's one-man sailboat, Napoleon Solo, like a toy in the hands of an angry child. But it wasn't just the storm he had to fear. That night, under a moonless sky, something massive, something unseen, collided with the boat. The sickening crack of splintering wood filled the air, followed by an ominous gurgling as seawater rushed in. Callahan's worst nightmare was unfolding. His vessel, the culmination of his expertise as a naval architect, was dying beneath his feet. In the chaos, the sea seemed alive, eager to claim him. Forced to abandon ship, Callahan scrambled into his tiny lifeboat just as Napoleon Solo vanished into the abyss. Alone, drenched and shivering, he drifted aimlessly as the first light of dawn crept over the endless horizon. But the fight for survival had only begun. Before the Napoleon Solo sank, Callahan had salvaged what little he could: a spear gun, emergency rations, a sleeping bag, and 2 solar stills for water. As an experienced sailor, he understood the unforgiving nature of the ocean. He charted his survival plan. The Atlantic's currents and trade winds would eventually drift him towards civilization, if he could stay alive. The food rations didn't last long. Hunger clawed at his stomach, gnawing away at his strength and will. Desperate, Callahan turned to the spear gun. He knew the ocean's secret. Flotsam often became ecosystems, attracting fish and inevitably predators. It wasn't long before schools of mahi-mahi gathered around his lifeboat. His survival seemed possible. But the ocean is a cruel provider. Where small fish thrive, larger predators follow. One morning as the sea calmed, Callahan awoke to a sound that froze his blood, a soft lapping against the sides of his raft. He peered over the edge and saw them, 3 dorsal fins slicing through the water, moving in perfect circles. Sharks. The predators were enormous, their sandpaper skins scraping against the flimsy nylon walls of his raft. They could smell him. Callahan's breath came in ragged gasps as he realized the truth. The sharks weren't just curious. They were hunting. With trembling hands, he grabbed his spear gun. The weapon felt pitifully inadequate, but he had no choice. Leaning over the side, he jabbed at the circling beasts. Their thick, rubbery skin resisted the strikes, and within hours, his spear gun broke. Undeterred, Callahan lashed a knife to the shaft and continued the fight. Days turned into weeks. Callahan's body weakened, his mind teetering on the edge of madness. His solar stills, the fragile lifeline providing drinkable water, began to fail. Every breath was a struggle. Every moment felt like his last. Then came the tipping point. On the 44th day, Callahan caught a large mahi-mahi. Its death throes were violent, and in its final moments, the fish tore into the lifeboat's tubes, puncturing them. The raft's buoyancy was compromised. Panic set in as water seeped in. Callahan had to repair the raft, but doing so meant plunging his arms into shark-infested waters. The predators returned, sensing his vulnerability. Fear turned to rage. Callahan lashed out at the ocean, screaming into the emptiness. Yet deep inside, He knew rage wouldn't save him. He improvised. Using a plastic fork from a Boy Scout mess kit, he patched the raft as best he could. Exhausted, he collapsed into restless sleep. When he awoke, the patch held. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a sliver of hope. By the 76th day, Callahan was barely human. He was skeletal, hallucinating visions of the dead beckoning him into the deep. His last cans of water were gone. His body was failing. Then, as if the universe had finally relented, a miracle appeared. On the horizon, a fishing vessel emerged, drawn by the seabirds circling above his lifeboat. The birds had been scavenging the ecosystem Callahan's lifeboat had created, their presence a silent beacon for the fishermen. As the boat approached, Callahan lay limp, too weak to even wave. The men aboard gasped at the sight of him, a hollow-eyed ghost of a man who had cheated death. Callahan's rescue was nothing short of miraculous. By the time he was pulled aboard, he had lost a third of his body weight. It took weeks before he could walk again. Yet, in his own words, he bore no regrets. The stars, he once said, were like heaven seen from a seat in hell. The ocean had broken him, but it had also transformed him. Stephen Callahan's 76 days adrift remain a testament to human endurance, but his tale is more than one of survival. It is a haunting reminder of the ocean's indifference, a force that can offer beauty and death in the same breath. The ocean was eerily calm that night, its vast expanse cloaked in darkness. Beneath the surface, something ancient stirred, something hungry. For the men of the USS Indianapolis, there would be no warning, no escape. Their fate was sealed before they even realized the ocean had turned against them. It began on July 30th, 1945. The USS Indianapolis, a Portland-class heavy cruiser of the United States Navy, had just completed a mission of unimaginable importance. Carrying parts for the world's first deployable atomic bomb, the ship had raced to the island of Tinian at record-breaking speed. Its crew felt the pride of a mission accomplished, yet they were unaware that death lurked just beneath the waves. As the cruiser sailed toward Leyte for training, disaster struck. Just after midnight, the Indianapolis was spotted by a Japanese submarine. Alone, without escort, and lacking sonar capabilities, the ship was a vulnerable target. At exactly 12:15 a.m., 2 Type 95 torpedoes ripped through its side with thunderous force. The impact was catastrophic. Flames erupted, metal screamed as it twisted apart, and men were hurled into the ocean like ragdolls. Within just 12 minutes, the USS Indianapolis was gone, swallowed by the Pacific. Over 300 men went down with her, leaving nearly 900 survivors adrift in a sea that would soon become their graveyard. At first, the men clung to hope. Surely, they thought, rescue would come within hours. But unknown to them, their SOS signals had been ignored. The Navy had lost track of their ship, and the commanders who might have acted dismissed the calls as false alarms, or worse, traps. For the sailors floating in the open ocean, the nightmare was only beginning. When dawn broke, they saw it, the glint of dorsal fins slicing through the water. The sharks had arrived. Drawn by the chaos of the sinking and the scent of blood, dozens, perhaps hundreds, of oceanic whitetips and tiger sharks began circling the survivors. At first, the predators feasted on the dead, their massive bodies thrashing as they tore into the lifeless flesh. But soon, the corpses were gone. The sharks turned their attention to the living. The attacks were relentless and unpredictable. A man would be talking one moment, his voice trembling with fear, only to be dragged screaming into the depths the next. Survivors watched helplessly as their comrades disappeared beneath the waves, the water around them stained crimson. Each attack eroded their sanity, leaving them hollow-eyed and trembling. Some men tried to fight back, thrashing and screaming to ward off the predators. But the frantic movements only attracted more sharks, mimicking the death throes of wounded prey. Others succumbed to despair, their bodies giving out under the unrelenting sun by day, and the bone-chilling cold by night. By the third day, madness took hold. Men began to hallucinate, seeing rescue ships that weren't there or claiming they could hear planes overhead. One sailor swore he saw the Indianapolis just below the surface, its mess hall stocked with fresh water. He dove repeatedly, inviting others to join him, but the water he drank was the salty ocean. He died shortly after, his body convulsing from the poison. On the fourth day, salvation finally came, but only for a few. A Navy seaplane happened to spot the survivors, its crew horrified by the sight of hundreds of men clinging to life amidst a sea of sharks. They signaled for rescue, and after what felt like an eternity, help arrived. Out of nearly 1,200 crew members, only 317 survived. For those who lived, the ordeal left scars that would never heal. But the horror didn't end there. Captain Charles McVeigh, commander of the Indianapolis, was court-martialed for failing to evade the torpedo attack. Though even the Japanese submarine captain testified that nothing could have saved the ship. Cleared of some charges but burdened by guilt, McVeigh spent the rest of his life haunted by the loss of his men. In 1968, unable to escape the ghosts of the past, McVeigh ended his life on his front lawn with the Navy-issued revolver he had carried since his service began. The story of the USS Indianapolis is not just a tale of war. It is a story of unimaginable suffering, of men consumed by the merciless sea and the predators within it. And even decades later, the silent screams of those lost beneath the waves still echo, a haunting reminder of how the ocean never forgets. The distress call crackled over the static-filled airwaves, sending chills down the spines of the radio operators who intercepted it. All officers are dead, including the captain, lying in chart room and bridge, possibly the whole crew dead. I die. The message, fragmented and haunting, was accompanied by eerie, indecipherable Morse code, then silence. It was 1948, and the tropical waters of Southeast Asia's Malacca Strait, an essential artery for global shipping, had suddenly become the stage for one of the most baffling and horrifying maritime mysteries in history. The strait itself, a narrow stretch of water squeezed between the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian island of Sumatra, has long been a place of legend and danger. Yet no pirate tale or storm story could prepare the world for the nightmare about to unfold aboard the Dutch freighter SS Ourang Medan. When the American merchant vessel Silver Star intercepted the distress signal, its crew knew they had to investigate. Setting a course toward the ship's last known coordinates, they found themselves sailing into an enigma drenched in blood and fear. The Silver Star spotted the Ourang Medan hours later, its silhouette ghostly against the horizon. The ship floated lifelessly, eerily still, as if time itself had abandoned it. No movement, no sound, just an unnatural calm that sent shivers through the rescue crew. Hailing the ship yielded no response. With growing unease, the captain of the Silver Star ordered a boarding party. What they found would haunt their memories forever. As the sailors climbed aboard, an icy chill greeted them. This alone was bizarre, given the tropical heat exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The deck was a charnel house. Lifeless bodies of the crew lay scattered, their faces frozen in expressions of sheer terror. Their limbs were grotesquely contorted, as if they had died trying to fend off some invisible assailant. Even the ship's dog hadn't escaped the horror. Its lifeless form, jaws locked in a final snarl, bore the same inexplicable expression of fear. In the captain's quarters, the master of the ship lay face down in a pool of blood and gore. His eyes stared blankly at nothing, wide with unimaginable terror. On the bridge, the officers and engineers were similarly mangled, their shredded uniforms the only clue to their identities. And then there was the radio operator, the one who had sent the chilling SOS. He remained seated at his station, his fingers still gripping the transmitter. His eyes, like all the others, were wide open, unblinking, and filled with a horror that death had failed to erase. The deeper the boarding party ventured, the more unsettling the scene became. The ship seemed unnaturally cold, despite the blazing sun outside, and while the bodies were undeniably fresh, they were decaying at an alarming rate, as though some unnatural force was accelerating the process. What struck the rescuers most was the absence of visible injuries on most of the crew. Aside from the bridge officers, who appeared to have been savagely torn apart, the others bore no wounds at all. It was as if they had simply dropped dead, their souls ripped from their bodies by an unseen force. The Ourang Medan itself showed no signs of external damage. There was no evidence of piracy, no indication of a mutiny or struggle, and yet something had killed every soul aboard. As the rescuers completed their grim inspection, the Silver Star's captain made the decision to tow the Ourang Medan back to port. But the ship had one final horror in store. As the Silver Star's crew secured tow lines, smoke began to billow from below decks. Panic ensued as they scrambled to sever the ropes. Moments later, the Ourang Medan erupted in a massive explosion, the blast so powerful it lifted the ship out of the water before it sank into the depths of the Malacca Strait. The chilling mystery of the Ourang Medan was now sealed beneath the waves. The story of the Ourang Medan has been told and retold, each version adding to its mystique. Official records of the ship's existence are scarce, and some argue it never sailed at all. Skeptics point out that the Silver Star itself was operating under a different name during the time of the incident. Yet believers insist the ship was real. Its name derived from the Indonesian city of Medan in Sumatra. They speculate that its deadly cargo, possibly chemical or biological weapons left over from World War II, may have been the cause of the tragedy. One theory links the Ourang Medan to Unit 731, a secret Japanese military facility notorious for its inhumane experiments. After the war, the theory goes, deadly biological agents were smuggled out of Asia aboard civilian vessels to avoid detection. A catastrophic leak aboard the Ourang Medan could explain the sudden deaths and the eerie lack of external injuries. Whether the Ourang Medan was a victim of human folly, supernatural forces, or some combination of the two, the truth remains elusive. To this day, the story of the ghost ship lingers in the shadowy corners of maritime lore, a haunting reminder of the perils that lie beneath the surface of the sea. Perhaps it is better that we never uncover the full truth. After all, some mysteries are best left to the depths. The sand beneath his feet was soft, warm, a stark contrast to the cold, relentless ocean. The water lapped gently at his ankles, soothing his soreness after a grueling morning of soccer. But when 16-year-old Sam Kazan stepped out of the shallows of Brighton Beach that Saturday, something was wrong. His feet felt strange, tingling like 1,000 tiny needles piercing his skin. When he looked down, his breath caught in his throat. Blood. Bright, vivid, and unstoppable, it trickled down his legs and pooled on the golden sand beneath him. Panicked, Sam rushed back into the ocean, desperate to let the salt water cleanse his wounds. But even as the waves washed over his feet, the bleeding wouldn't stop. The more he looked, the more it became clear. This wasn't just a cut or scrape. His legs were covered in tiny pinprick-sized wounds, too many to count. His father wasted no time. Within minutes, they were racing toward Dandenong Hospital. Sam sat in the waiting room, his legs wrapped in a towel that quickly soaked through with blood. It wasn't long before the floor beneath him was dotted with crimson. Nurses and doctors exchanged puzzled glances, their confusion growing with every passing minute. Specialists were called in, toxicologists, marine biologists, but no one could explain the strange, relentless bleeding. The wounds were small, like something had nipped at his flesh, but the damage was catastrophic. Finally, someone whispered a name, sea lice. At first it sounded absurd. Sea lice were tiny, shrimp-like parasites that fed on fish, not people. They were barely visible to the naked eye and harmless in small numbers. But Sam's injuries told a different story. Something far more sinister had happened in those waters. Sam's father, determined to uncover the truth, returned to the beach with a net and raw slices of beef. He submerged the bait in the same waters where his son had waded hours earlier. When he pulled the net back up, his stomach turned. The meat was swarming with hundreds, no, thousands of tiny creatures. They weren't just feeding on the flesh. They were draining it of blood, leaving behind nothing but pale, shredded tissue. He filmed the gruesome discovery and rushed back to the hospital. Marine experts reviewed the footage in stunned silence. These weren't ordinary sea lice. They were something far more aggressive. Adult sea lice, particularly the females, can become ravenous under certain conditions. Once they latch onto a source of protein, they feed with relentless hunger, consuming tissue, mucus, and even blood. Dr. Walker Smith, a marine biologist, reviewed the case. "It's impossible," he muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "These creatures aren't predators. They don't swarm like piranhas." But the evidence was undeniable. Sam had disturbed a feeding frenzy, a rare and horrifying event. His injuries were so severe that even seasoned experts were left shaken. Jeff Weir, the executive director of the Australian Dolphin Research Institute, recounted his own experience. While diving beneath a nearby pier, he had surfaced to find blood streaming from his cheeks and forehead. Even so, he admitted that Sam's encounter was the worst he'd ever seen. "They're vital to the ecosystem," one expert explained, trying to downplay the horror. "Like scavengers of the sea." But for this to happen, he must have been there far longer than he realized. Sam's story didn't just terrify the locals of Brighton. Thousands of miles away in Virginia Beach, swimmers reported similar encounters. Tiny bites, relentless itching, and rashes that lasted for days sent terrified beachgoers running from the water. Some even ended up in local hospitals, convinced they were infected with a mysterious disease. Experts in Virginia were quick to clarify. In their case, the culprits weren't sea lice but blue crab larvae, tiny creatures that looked like alien lobsters with pincers sharp enough to irritate human skin. While not dangerous, their swarming behavior was enough to keep people out of the water. But Sam's case was different. His encounter highlighted a chilling truth. The ocean, vast and mysterious, holds secrets we may never fully understand. Beneath its surface lurk creatures and phenomena that defy explanation. For Sam, the scars eventually healed. But the memory of that day, of feeling his flesh nibbled away by a swarm of unseen predators, remains. And as he stands on the shore now, looking out at the tranquil waves, he knows one thing for certain. We are strangers in the ocean's world, and sometimes the ocean reminds us.